G'day, captains. How we doing out there? All right, so today we're going to be looking at the Flag in Wind compiled wire patch. So this is an effect that works with Resolume Arena 7.4 and higher. And the compiled wire patch download link is linked in the video description below. And just a quick heads up, it is about a 2 GB download. So just before you jump in, just be aware of that. So what does this actually do? So what you're looking at here, if I turn it off, this is just a standard checker. And with the effect on, we do have this look. So before we jump in, I want to acknowledge that, yes, you can do something kind of similar using the built-in arena tools. So you could do something like the wave warp, maybe double that up, and add some other effects that are newer in there. But I find this is really uniform and it seems very 2D in the way it deforms things. So the difference here is we're actually taking a 3D object and remapping some things to it. So what actually comes with this? So we've got the first thing, which is the opacity slider, basically the amount that's on there. We have the wind speed, so we can drop this down to half speed, or we can crank it up so it's much, much faster. And then we have the shadow amount. So if I turn this off, it's just going to be the motion that is inherited. But if I turn it all the way up, you can see there are some dark parts where the shadows really kick in. And I've set this to 7.75 as default. So let's have another look in here. So this is how it works on a static checker. What also is really cool is, so if we say we have a logo and we want to turn it into a flag, here is the logo of the greatest Canadian hockey team ever. Don't at me. So if we wanted to, again, drag the flag in wind effect onto this, and it's going to put it onto a flag. And it's going to have a gray background. Now, the reason that is because this logo actually has, if I bypass this, it has a transparent background. So it's going to fill the space with gray. Luckily here, we actually have a flag color option. So we can come in here and color pick any color we want for the back of the flag. One thing I find really useful here is if we just bypass this for a second, click on the eyedropper, we can actually come across and pick an exact color from the logo, say this blue, and we bring this back in, the exact blue from the logo is now going to be in the flag behind. Now, if you look at the order in which you've placed this, I've placed this effect below the transform, which means that I can actually adjust the scale of this logo and the effect will actually happen afterwards. So you can even scale it up nicely like this. This doesn't only affect for photos as well, so you can use videos. Here is the logo of a BC native Neon Steve, and it's animated. And again, we can just grab this effect, drag it on, and the animated effect still works with the flag. Again, because it has a transparent background, we can come in and say we want to maybe make this more of a darker purple sort of color, and there we go. But what if we want to do things in a column? Say we've got two things here. We want to have not only a background, but a logo on top of it. Again, this is Neon Steve. We can then, instead of doing it in a column, we can put both of these into a group, or we can just apply this effect to the composition. So underneath, now everything inside our composition is going to be affected. I'm just going to turn this a little bit down in wind speed and a little bit down in shadow amount. And everything inside now that we play is going to be affected in the column. Or if we had, say, this logo here, let's turn off the individual one. And let's drag our checkered flag underneath. And now we can see we can build looks. And because the effect is happening at the composition level, it is taking all of this composition into effect and then putting our flag into it. So how does this actually work? So this compiled wire patch actually takes in two videos that I've rendered out from a program called Notch. And these two videos are this UV textured version of the flag and this white textured of the flag that has some shadows on it. So I'm going to show you first how we jump into Notch to make this look and get these renders out. And then we're going to be jumping into Wire to build this look. So the timestamps are below. Feel free to jump ahead if you want to look to a certain position, and I'll see you in Notch shortly. Alrighty, so here's the Notch layer that I use to generate the flapping flag. If I jump into an orbit view by pressing the 5 key, in here, you can see that this is actually a 3D piece of geometry that is being deformed. So what it is, there is a shape 3D plane that is being set to 16 by 9 wide. So 16 divided by 9 is 1.777. And it also has 160 by 90 subdivisions for our base geometry. And as you can see on the left side here, I'm just going to return to the camera view, 0. The left side here is relatively unaffected by the noise and the distortion. Now, I wanted to do this because if you wanted to add a flagpole or something in here, I wanted that side to be normal. Now, the way this is sort of being attempted inside of Notch is I'm using something called a generate Weightmap deformer. So what this is looking for here is there's an input for an image. So when the generated Weightmap deformer is set in its attributes to texture, we can feed it in something like a gradient. Now, this gradient here is set to be all the way across the left and very, very crimped in. But where the black sections of the image are, the deformers will not affect it. And where the white, fully white sections of the weight map are, the deformers will completely go to town. And it's going to just interpolate between them. One thing I do like to do with generate weight maps is I like to manually feed in a color ramp where a black is first and a white is second. This is also just to help that there's no alpha issues at all. And the other thing I like to do, especially when we're doing a tight gradient like this, is add an edge-aware blur. So basically, it's going to take the edges into account and not blur those between the black and the white, but it's going to just blur nicely between our fully black and our fully white gradient. Okay, so now we've got our area of interest, you can imagine. Let's add our first deformer, and that is actually going to be here. I'm just going to just turn all of these off. And the first one will be a sine deformer. Turn these. And this does what you expect it to do. It's a sine wave. It pulses things forward and backwards at a very predictable rate. So if we jump into here, I've turned the blend mode down a bit so it's not quite as intense. I've set the scale minor axis to negative, just so it's actually going to the right-hand side as opposed to moving towards the left. I've dropped the animation rate up to 4.8, so it's a little bit faster. And I've also set this to locked to timecode. Now, this will be important if we're rendering out multiple versions of this video, because it means that every time we render it, the exact same motions will be done. So that's our sine deformer. What I've also done here is I've gone from the output of our generate weight map into the input down here that is looking for a generated weight map. So we just go out and into here, and our sine deformer is now respecting the edge here. If I disable that, you can see that the edge is actually moving quite a lot. So because we made that weight map earlier, and that weight map is above our sine deformer, because again in Notch, stacking order matters, this is going to respect our new generated weight map. So what's next? Let's add in a turbulence. So this turbulence deformer here is going to, let's just turn off our sine deformer. You can see it just adds some nice extra motion in there that's not quite as uniform. I'm also using a continuous modifier here set to -1, which means that all of the turbulence that's being affected is actually being pushed across towards the right as well, roughly at about the same speed as our sine. So it just adds that extra bit of wind deformation going across. Okay, so thirdly, we're going to add some curl noise deformer. Again, this is going to look for our generated weight map, feed that in here nicely. And it's also going to take that continuous modifier to move it across in the X position. So if we isolate just the curl noise, you can see it's just adding a little bit more detail in here as well, some more sharp folds. But when it's all brought together, it really does add just a little bit of extra texture, turning it on and off here to our cloth. And finally, we're adding smoothing, which just means if there's any creases that are just far too defined, it'll just round those off nicely. So that is pretty much the main part of our deformer setup. So coming across here, we've added in a camera. Now this camera here is set to about 1.8 in the back. So if I actually disable all of this and hit 0, our camera's here. Now, this is a fine look. It's very flat and straight on, so it's great for seeing the logos. But what I wanted to do was add a math modifier that then alters the pitch of the null that's holding our camera. So imagine the camera is 1.8 units away from this central null, which is 0, 0, 0. So think of that like your elbow is the null, and the camera is where your hand is. So you can move your elbow up and down, and your hand will lift up and down. So basically links that in here. So this is just giving us that forward and backward motion that you can see here. Next, I've put a directional light, and that is just tilted about 48 degrees down, and that's going to give us our shadows here. So we can see from the top down, we can see there's a little bit of shadows and folds, and we want to just get that lighting in there because this is our main shadow pass. Now this shadow pass is basically just going to sit here and going to be something we composite inside of Wire later. Well, there's a couple extra things we really want to do inside of here before we move on. If we go into our root node here, we want to make sure that our deferred rendering is ticked, our high dynamic range and our linear lighting is ticked. And we also want to change our composite blend mode to blend with alpha channel. Now this is going to make sure that everything that isn't this particular thing here, like all this black in the background, is all going to be transparent when we render this out. And that's going to be pretty important because we're going to, inside of Wire later, look for that alpha channel to drive some extra movements. Alrighty, so now we've got this set up. We can actually just go in and set this up inside of our render queue. So if you haven't got your render queue there, come across to view, turn on render queue. If you press the F2 key, you can go into your timeline setting and just click, hold, and drag up to the render layer. Here you can double click on something here, give it a name, give it a title, and then you'll be able to render it out. Now I'm using Notch LC with the ticked render alpha layer channel. I've also set it to be 60 frames a second. And the length I've set this for is for 33 because in After Effects, I'll actually be overlapping the last 1 second and blending that in. So it's a 32-second loop. Okay. I don't need to render this out because I've already done so. So F1 back into your graph mode. All right. So this is going to be our look for shadows. Now, if you wanted to be really sure this would look the same all the time, you can drag in a material here. So I'm just going to hide this one. And this material here is just a standard white material. There's nothing changed. If you wanted to give it a little bit more color, you could basically bring some colors in here. But the purpose of this is just to be a grayscale look. All right. So now we've built our shadow look. We need to build our UV map look. And that's a little bit more intense. So I'm just going to turn this material off and turn on the second material here. Now this may look a little strange. So I'm going to step it through from the start. So our gradients we're going to start looking here. What we really want to do is get a look here that basically has green from one axis and red from the other axis. So in this one in particular, you can see the green is coming up from the bottom and the red is coming in from the right. Now, this is actually flipped from what you'd want to do normally. You'd normally want to have your black section down in the bottom left-hand side, but because of the way that the plane takes a texture map, this is the correct way I've set it up. So let's step this through all the way from the start. We have some gradients, and these gradients here are basically set up as, looking in, the gradient, if we turn off this channel boolean, is a linear y-axis set to 1920 by 1920. Then we're going to apply a channel boolean to this one. And we're going to say that our red source is 0. Our green source is looking for the luminance because remember, this is just a black and white image at the start. Our blue source is 0 and our alpha source is 1. And what's they're going to take is it's going to take a solid green to a black faded gradient. Our second gradient down here is going to be the opposite. So if we turn off our channel boolean here, it's going to be set to linear x-axis. And this is going to go from a black on the left to a white on the right. If we come into our channel boolean we've set up here, we've got a red source is going to look at luminance. So again, where it's black, and where it was white is now red. green source is 0, blue source is 0, alpha source is 1. So again, if you don't know how to do this, holding down shift and double clicking on a lot of nodes will bring up a preview of what they look like. So I'm going to drag this back in to make it a little bit cleaner. So I've added here some video nulls just to be able to see what's going on. So here's our top one. It is green to black. And here is our bottom one, which is red to black. I've run these into a composite node set to screen. And this is basically just going to overlay these on top of each other. So again, here now we see our green is going from green to black at the top, but it's also being blended by the red to black from the sides. And this is our UV texture. What I've done now is fed this into a material. And this material is basically, all I've changed in all of this is running the output video null into the color texture. And I've scrolled down in here till I got to settings and unchecked lit. Because if you leave lit on, you can see all of the shadows are still in here and we don't want that data. All we want is the pure color data. So now this is rendering out exactly the same look, but it is now just the color UV texture. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did before, drag it up, render it out. We're going to name this one a UV color. And once we've got that rendered, we can now move across to our wire patch. Okay, now that we have our source video files rendered out of Notch, let's jump into the wire patch of how this is all put together. So if we look in here, there are two videos. So this is our first video here. This is our flag UV. I've called it UV. This is actually the color render we made in Notch. And then down here, I've got the flag UV shadow, which is that first render we made in Notch. So what we're going to do here is we're also going to make sure that this in our inspector is set to be an effect. Now this is different here. Like it's normally coming in as none. You can choose it to be a source, an effect, or a mixer. And the reason we're choosing effect is we want to be able to put this on top of another video inside of Resolume and then to be able to grab that texture in. So that leads us into our first of our nodes we're building in here. We've added a texture in node. Now this is going to grab whatever the effect is sitting on top of inside of Resolume. And what we're doing here is we're basically running this texture in into a video mixer. This video mixer is also grabbing a flag color input. Now this is just a color in. So if we want to come across here, double click in the open and type color, the American spelling in, this is going to generate an input that is available inside of Resolume. And it's going to allow us to change a color value. So I'm just going to delete this here. And this flag color here is set to dark gray at the moment. We also need to convert it to a texture so we can run it into a video mixture. So we just dragged in a texture node and ran this into the layer 1, which means this is going to be in the background layer. Inside our video mixer here, we've changed the mode to alpha, which means that whenever there is a texture and our value is full here, is going to be 100% opaque on top of the background. So if you have no transparency in the texture in you've dragged this effect onto in Resolume, that original video will fill the entire screen. If it has transparency, anything that is transparent will show the color we've selected here. So that's our first thing. That's our video in mixer. So the next thing we need to look at is jumping down into the flag UV color. Now I'm just going to play this again on the timeline. And I've just made sure that our flag UV color and our flag UV shadow both have the play, pause, and stop values coming from a transport play node. Now that just means that whenever the effect is clicked inside of Resolume, that cell or that clip is clicked, it's just going to restart playing. So what we need to do here is we need to feed it into a UV map remote. And basically what this is going to do is, like we built before, the green in the top left, the yellow in the top right, the red in the bottom right, and the black in the bottom left is going to be the coordinates that we're going to remap our new input to. What I've found multiple times testing the UV map tool inside of Resolume is I need to add a blur node, because if I take this blur node out and bypass it, when I come into here, you'll see this is very, very noisy. Even though this is a 32-bit channel video coming in. Wire just does not like rendered video UV maps. But if we enable this blur pass, we can see it looks really, really nice and really, really crisp. So if we look at the blur here, I've just set the distance to 0.05 for both values. I've set the quality to 1 and the Gaussian to 1. And again, that makes it look nice. All of the texture is retained, but it does give us some nasty blurring around the outsides, and it does repeat some of the images across the edges, which is a problem. So we're going to fix that later as well. So once we've done our remap here via our UV map, we're going to drop in another video mixer. And this is where we'll add in our flag UV shadow, which we've got down the bottom. So our flag UV shadow is going to run into the layer 2 level of our video mixer, whereas the outputted UV remapped image will go to our layer 1. Now this is, again, going to be on our bottom layer, and we're going to be overlaying our shadow on top. So what we've also added for our inputs over here is we've done a float in. So again, double click, float in. This will allow us, if we come across to our inspector, to set a minimum and a maximum and set a slider inside of Resolume. Now what I've done is I've set the shadow amount in here to be between 0 and 1 with the default value of 0.75. Now I've just run the output of this float in to the opacity slider of this video mixer, which means we can control the amount of shadow that gets overlaid on top of this look from inside of Resolume natively, because that's an exposed value. Alrighty. While we're over here as well, I've just also added another float in here I've called wind speed. Now I've made this between 0.05 and 2 with the default value being 1. And I've just run this into the speed input of the two videos that are playing, which means that when I increase this, the video speeds up. When I decrease it, it slows down. I'm just going to set that back to 1. So right now we have a texture feeding in. It is being overlaid on top of our background color. We have both of our UV coordinates and our shadows being mixed with our input. So now we have this composited look. Now, before I talked about, hey, look, these edges are blurred and they're getting some color data and some regional data we don't want. So how do we fix that? So coming off of our flag UV, and before I said it was really important that we had a clear transparent background, we're going to use a color mask node here. I'm going to uncheck everything besides alpha. So all this is going to do is basically say, where is this image solid? We're going to put a solid black. And that's what it's done right here. So again, where you can see the color here is where you can see the black, and it keeps this transparent image. But we want to use this as a mask. So we need this particular black section here to be white. We can use an invert RGB, which is found inside of our video effects invert RGB. Connect that in. And now we have white, which is cool. But if we feed this directly into a mask, we're still going to be grabbing all of the outside. So we need to be able to trim off a little bit of the edges. And the best way I found to do that was use the edge detect node. So if we use edge detect and we set our strength to be 100 and our sample offset to be 10 and 10, we get this thick white border around the outside. Now this is basically going to be the same sort of size as that blurred look. So we can really use this to just, wherever it's white, just trim off that blur. So we come in here and we use another video mixer. These things are great. So directly off of the invert RGB, we run this into our layer 1. And then because we've linked our invert RGB to our edge detection, and we've got this here, we're running this into our layer 2. And in our video mixer, we've actually got difference inverse. So what it's looking for here is this basically saying, what is the difference between the solid color here and the color here, but flipped, which eventually will actually say we're masking off all of that blurring. So by using a mask node here and dragging out into our mask and inverting it. So before we'd normally get just the outside, we're now just getting the inside. So side by side, without the mask, we can see all of this color bleeding through. And with that mask now, we are just trimming off that blurred edge. So it's nice and clean. One thing you may notice is at the top of the screen and the bottom of the screen, whenever the flag touches, you get these really nasty artifacts and jagged edges. So the way we've got around that is we just basically come into a transform node and just scaled it up 0.05. So it's just a small zoom punch in, but it's enough just to hide that extra blurred edge. And then we're running to a texture out. So what we have here, again, from the top is a texture in, which is basically what our Resolume clip is going to be before we put this effect on it. We have our two videos we've rendered out from Notch and brought in. We've blurred our UV pass and used a UV map to say, take this video, but distort it to be in the UV coordinates of this video. We've taken a video mixer here and blended in a shadow so we can add the extra depth. We've used a mask here to remove the extra blurred area around the outside. We've just scaled it up slightly, and now we're sending it as a texture out back to Resolume. Now I'm just going to jump back to Resolume to wrap this up just so we can have another quick look at this. Before I forget, because these are external video files here, you'll see them inside the resources here. Now, when you save a wire patch, it does not save the resources. It just saves the link to where they are on your computer. So if you wanted to give this to someone else, you're going to need to compile it, which is going to be under the patch and compile here. Now, what this will do, this will actually take all of your resources and everything you have here and compile them down, not just to a wired file, but a C-wired file. And this will basically mean that it's going to include the video files we have here, which will mean that this compiled wire, not block, it is a patch, will be about 2 gigabytes in size, just because this is about 1.8 gigabytes video file, and this is about a 0.2, which is here, the transparent. So just to be aware about that, these are quite large files just because I've used very large videos, but you can use much smaller videos to get the same effect going. So just wrapping this up, again, once you've installed the wire patch here, flag in wind, you just basically find whatever you want to apply this to. Again, this is just a check it effect. You just drag from your effects, drop it in, and you're now going to have a flag flapping in the wind where you can control the wind speed. You can control the color. So again, let's jump back to here because it has a transparent background. You can control the color of the background, and you can control the amount of shadows you want to be overlaid on top. So I really hope this is something that's really useful for your shows going forward. I'm looking forward to definitely working a lot more with these UV map passes inside of Wire. I have a Notch file that actually exports regions and specific items out as UV and alpha layers. So I'll probably do a follow-up video of that in the future. And again, the wire patch download link is in the video descriptions if you want to download it. And if you want to see more of the stuff I do, head across to @controlledchaos on Instagram, which is spelled CTRLDCHAOS. So good luck with your upcoming shows, captains, and have a fantastic week.